Cage of Golden Chains. New York, 1922. Margaret Calloway's father had left her James Calloway's pocket watch, broken since the day he was reported dead. One evening, she set it on her nightstand. Hours later, it was ticking. And the time? The exact moment James had died. Chapter 1. The Inheritance of Silence. The mahogany box felt heavier than it should have. Margaret Calloway traced the inlaid silver initials, J.C., with a fingertip roughened by years of working linen, not the delicate silks and laces she'd once dreamed of. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay the watch. A simple, sturdy thing, its gold casing dulled with age, its glass face cracked like a spiderweb, forever frozen at 10:17. The watch that had stopped ticking on the very day her father, James Calloway, had ceased to exist, somewhere in the muddy, blood-soaked fields of France. It had been 4 years since the telegram arrived, crisp and cruel in its brevity. Regret to inform killed in action Psalm deepest sympathies. The words had echoed in the grand, yet increasingly empty, rooms of their Fifth Avenue townhouse, a hollow counterpoint to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock that, unlike her father's, relentlessly marched on. Her mother, Eleanor, had retreated into a world of black crepe and silent grief, a world Margaret couldn't penetrate. The vibrant social life that had once filled their home with laughter and music had withered, replaced by the hushed whispers of sympathetic callers and the clinking of teacups offered in strained condolences. The house, once a beacon of warmth, now felt like a mausoleum, each room a monument to a life and a love lost. Margaret, at 26, had found herself adrift. Her fiancé, Robert, a promising young lawyer from a family as established as their own, had politely but firmly withdrawn his proposal. The war had changed everything, he'd explained, his eyes avoiding hers. Futures were uncertain, fortunes were fragile, and a woman whose father had died a hero's death, while noble, was also a burden. His words, unspoken but clearly understood, hung in the air between them like a shroud. She hadn't blamed him. Not really. The war had taken more than just lives, it had taken hope, security, the very fabric of their world. It had left her with a broken watch, a grieving mother, and a house filled with the ghosts of what might have been. The watch had been among the few personal effects returned from the front. A mud-stained leather wallet containing a faded photograph of Eleanor and a younger, carefree Margaret. A silver locket engraved with a single forget-me-not. And the watch. Her father had always been meticulous about time. Punctuality, he declared, was the hallmark of a gentleman. Now, its stillness was a constant, painful reminder of his absence. She'd kept it locked away, a tangible piece of her shattered past. But tonight, something had drawn her to it. Perhaps it was the anniversary of the telegram, a date etched into her memory with the searing precision of a branding iron. Perhaps it was the oppressive silence of the house, broken only by the mournful chime of the distant church bells. She placed the watch on her nightstand, the moonlight illuminating its cracked face. The silver hands, forever frozen at 10:17, seemed to gleam with an unnatural intensity. She stared at it, a knot of grief tightening in her chest. She traced the crack with the tip of her nail, a physical manifestation of the way her world had fractured along with it. Exhaustion, a constant companion these past years, finally claimed her. She drifted to sleep, the image of the watch imprinted on her mind's eye. The sound was faint at first, a barely perceptible whisper in the stillness of the night. A rhythmic, insistent tick-tick-tick. Margaret stirred, her mind still clouded with sleep. She thought it was the grandfather clock in the hall, its familiar chimes strangely muted. But as she became more aware, she realized the sound was coming from her nightstand. Her eyes snapped open. The room was bathed in the soft, pre-dawn light, and the watch was ticking. She sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached out a trembling hand and picked it up. The cold metal sent a shiver down her spine. The second hand was sweeping smoothly around the dial, a steady, unwavering pulse in the silence. And the time was not 10:17. It was 3:48 a.m. Margaret stared at the watch, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. It was impossible. The watch had been broken for 4 years. It had been silent, lifeless, a relic of a past that could never be recovered. And yet, here it was, ticking away as if nothing had ever happened. But it wasn't just ticking. As she watched, mesmerized, the hands continued to move, not forward, but backward. Slowly, deliberately, they retraced their path, unwinding the years, the months, the days. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the watch tighter, her knuckles white. This wasn't just a mechanical anomaly. This was something else. Something that defied logic, that challenged the very foundations of her understanding of the world. The hands continued their backward journey, the ticking a hypnotic rhythm in the quiet room. And then, with a final, almost imperceptible click, they stopped. They stopped at 10:17, the exact time of her father's death. A cold dread seeped into her bones, a feeling far more profound than grief. It was a primal fear, a sense of the uncanny, of a boundary crossed. The watch, her father's watch, was not just a timepiece. It was a connection to something or someone lost in the mists of time and war. And it had just awakened. The question, the terrifying, exhilarating question, was why? And more importantly, to what or whom was it now connected? The inheritance she held was no longer silent. It had spoken, and the sound was the ticking countdown of a mystery she now had no choice but to unravel. Chapter 2. A whisper across time. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 5 times, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the house. Margaret remained frozen, the watch clutched in her hand, the echo of its impossible ticking still ringing in her ears. 10:17, the time of death. But what did it mean? She examined the watch again, turning it over and over in her hands. The back was plain, except for a small inscription, almost worn away by time and use. Pour toujours, mon amour. For always, my love.
Eleanor.
Her mother's inscription, a testament to a love that had been brutally cut short by a war that had stolen so much. Margaret had always believed in the rational, the explainable. She'd been raised on logic and reason, on the immutable laws of science and nature. But this defied all of that. This was a whisper from a realm beyond understanding, a message from the other side of a veil she hadn't even known existed. She thought of her father, James Calloway, a man of science, a doctor who had dedicated his life to healing. He had volunteered for the medical corps, driven by a sense of duty and a deep-seated belief in his ability to make a difference. He'd written letters home, filled with descriptions of the horrors he'd witnessed, the endless stream of wounded and dying, the sheer scale of human suffering. But he'd also written of hope, of the resilience of the human spirit, of the camaraderie he'd found among his fellow soldiers. And then, the letters had stopped. Could the watch be a message from him? A way of reaching out across the chasm of death. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. The idea that some part of him, some essence, might still exist, that he wasn't entirely lost, filled her with a desperate, aching hope. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening, what the watch was trying to tell her. But where to begin? Her mother, still lost in her grief, would be no help. And the few friends she had left, those who hadn't been swept away by the war or its aftermath, would likely dismiss it as a delusion, a product of her grief-stricken mind. Then she remembered. Mr. Silas Blackwood, the clockmaker. Mr. Blackwood's shop was a tiny, cluttered space tucked away on a narrow side street, a world away from the bustling avenues of Fifth Avenue. It was a place of intricate gears, delicate tools, and the constant, soothing tick-tock of countless clocks, a symphony of time. He'd been her father's friend, a fellow enthusiast of all things mechanical. He'd repaired the family's clocks for years, and Margaret remembered him as a kind, quiet man with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple, practical dress, a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns she'd once worn. The city was already awake, the streets filled with the rumble of delivery trucks, the clatter of horses' hooves, the shouts of street vendors. But Margaret felt detached from it all, as if she were moving through a dream, guided only by the insistent pulse of the watch in her pocket. She found Mr. Blackwood in his shop, hunched over a workbench, his magnifying glass glinting in the morning light. He looked older, his hair thinner, his shoulders stooped with the weight of years, but his eyes still held that same spark of gentle curiosity. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice raspy with age, but his tone welcoming. "It's been a long time." "Mr. Blackwood," Margaret replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I need your help." She took the watch from her pocket and placed it on the workbench. Mr. Blackwood picked it up, his fingers surprisingly nimble despite their age. He examined it closely, turning it over and over, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Your father's watch," he said softly. "I remember it well. A fine piece of craftsmanship." "It had started ticking last night," Margaret said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "After 4 years. And then it went backwards. To the time he died." Mr. Blackwood didn't dismiss her. He didn't scoff or offer platitudes. He simply listened, his eyes fixed on hers, his expression one of profound understanding. "Time," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is a curious thing, Miss Calloway. We think of it as linear, a river flowing in one direction. But perhaps it's more like a sea, with currents and eddies, with depths we cannot fathom." He opened the back of the watch, revealing the intricate mechanism within. He poked and prodded with a tiny tool, his movements precise and deliberate. "There's nothing mechanically wrong with it," he said finally. "Nothing that would explain this." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and concern. "There are things, Miss Calloway," he said, "that science cannot explain. Things that lie beyond the realm of our understanding. Your father, he believed in those things. He believed in the power of the human spirit, in the possibility of connections that transcend the boundaries of life and death." He closed the watch and handed it back to her. "I cannot tell you what this is," he said, "but I can tell you this. It is not a trick. It is not a delusion. It is something real. And it is connected to your father." He paused, his gaze drifting to a dusty shelf filled with old books and strange instruments. "There's an old legend," he began, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "about watches like these. Crafted with a particular intention. They say, under the right circumstances, in the hands of someone with a strong enough connection, they can become conduits, bridges between worlds." He looked back at Margaret, his eyes searching hers. "Your father, Miss Calloway, was a man of strong will, and even stronger love. He believed, even in the face of death, that love could endure. Perhaps this is his way of proving it." His words hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in the face of the impossible. The watch, warm in her hand, seemed to pulse with a renewed energy. It was a whisper, yes, but a whisper that now held a name, a purpose, and the daunting promise of a journey into the unknown. The silence had been broken, and now, a faint echo of the psalm, of a love that refused to die, was calling her name. Chapter 3. The Clockmaker's Secret. Mr. Blackwood's words echoed in Margaret's mind as she walked back to Fifth Avenue, the watch a tangible weight in her pocket. Conduits. Bridges between worlds. It was a concept that belonged in the realm of fairy tales, not in the pragmatic, post-war reality of 1922 New York. Yet, she couldn't deny what she had seen, what she had felt. The city, usually a source of vibrant energy, now seemed muted, almost irrelevant. Her focus was entirely inward, consumed by the mystery of the watch and the implications of Mr. Blackwood's words. He had known her father, had understood his belief in something beyond the tangible. But what was that something? Back in her room, she spread out the contents of the mahogany box on her bed. The watch, the wallet, the locket. She opened the locket, revealing a tiny, faded photograph of her mother, her youthful face radiant with happiness. On the back of the photograph, a single word was inscribed in her father's handwriting. Always. The word resonated with the inscription on the watch, Pour toujours, mon amour. Two different languages, expressing the same enduring sentiment. A love that was meant to last forever. A love that, perhaps, had lasted, in some way, beyond the grave. She picked up the wallet, its leather worn and cracked. Inside, she found a few crumpled banknotes, a membership card for the New York Medical Society, and a small, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding. It was a letter, written in her father's familiar script, but it wasn't addressed to her or her mother.
Il doit s'adresser tout Monsieur Antoine Dubois, rue de la Paix, Amiens, France.
The name meant nothing to her.
Amiens.
She knew it was a city in France, a strategic location during the war, close to the Somme. But who was Antoine Dubois? And why had her father written to him? The letter was dated July 14, 1918, just weeks before her father's death. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, as if he'd been writing under pressure in secret. My dearest Antoine, the situation here grows more dire by the day. The casualties are staggering, beyond anything I could have imagined. I fear this war will never end. But amidst the horror, I have found something. Something that gives me hope. Something that I must protect. I know I can trust you, Antoine. You have always been a loyal friend, a man of honor. I am entrusting you with a secret that could change everything. It is connected to the watch. The one I gave you for safekeeping. Do not let it fall into the wrong hands. If anything should happen to me, you must find my daughter, Margaret. She is in New York. She is the key. She will understand. I have faith, my friend. Faith in you. Faith in her. Faith in the power of love to overcome even death. Yours in hope and desperation, James. Margaret read the letter again and again, her mind reeling. Her father had a secret connected to the watch, to a man named Antoine Dubois in Amiens, France. And she, somehow, was the key. The letter raised more questions than it answered. What was the something her father had found? What was the secret he was entrusting to Antoine Dubois? And what did he mean by the watch I gave you for safekeeping? Had her father owned 2 watches? A sudden thought struck her. Mr. Blackwood had said the watch could be a conduit. Could this other watch, the one in Amiens, be the other end of that connection? The idea was overwhelming, almost unbelievable. But it was the only explanation that made any sense. Her father had somehow known, or suspected, that he might die. He had prepared, had left a trail of clues, a message in a bottle tossed into the sea of time, hoping it would reach her. She looked at the watch in her hand, its hands still frozen at 10:17. It was no longer just a broken timepiece. It was a lifeline, a link to her father, to a secret that lay hidden across the ocean, in the war-torn landscape of France. She knew what she had to do. She had to go to Amiens. She had to find Antoine Dubois. She had to uncover the truth about her father's secret, about the watch, about the power of a love that refused to be silenced by death. The journey would be dangerous, daunting. She was a woman alone, traveling to a country still reeling from the devastation of war. She had no money, no connections, no experience in navigating the treacherous currents of international intrigue. But she had the watch. She had her father's letter. And she had a fierce, unwavering determination to find the answers, to honor his memory, to understand the legacy he had left behind. The clockmaker's secret was out, whispered on the wind, and carried across the sea. It was a secret that demanded to be uncovered, a secret that held the key to her past, and perhaps to her future. The time of death was now a starting point, a beginning, and Margaret was ready to follow its lead, wherever it might take her. The silent inheritance was silent no more. Its ticking had guided her toward a desperate journey. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Somme. The decision to go to France felt both reckless and inevitable. Margaret had spent the past few days in a whirlwind of activity, driven by a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. Selling the few remaining pieces of valuable jewelry her mother hadn't already pawned provided a meager sum, enough for a one-way passage on a steamship and a few weeks of living expenses. She told her mother she was going to visit a distant cousin in Boston, a fabricated story that Eleanor, lost in her own world of grief, had accepted without question. The guilt of deceiving her mother gnawed at Margaret, but she knew she couldn't tell her the truth. The idea of her father's mysterious secret, of a journey to war-torn France, would be too much for her fragile spirit to bear. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and arduous. The ship, crowded with returning soldiers, weary aid workers, and hopeful immigrants, was a microcosm of the world's upheaval. Margaret kept to herself, spending most of her time on deck, staring out at the vast, endless ocean, the watch a constant presence in her pocket. She practiced her French, a skill she'd neglected since her school days, poring over a battered phrasebook and whispering conversations to herself. She imagined meeting Antoine Dubois, picturing him as an older version of her father, a man of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. But beneath the surface of her determination, fear lurked. She was stepping into the unknown, venturing into a world of shadows and secrets, a world where danger was a constant companion. She had no idea what awaited her in Amiens, what she would find, or who she would encounter. The echoes of the war were everywhere, even on the ship. She overheard conversations among the soldiers, fragments of stories filled with horror and loss, with the names of battles that had become synonymous with death. Verdun, Ypres, the Somme.
The Somme.
The place where her father had died. The names sent a shiver down her spine. She imagined the muddy trenches, the constant shelling, the stench of death and decay. She tried to picture her father there, tending to the wounded, his hands stained with blood, his heart filled with a mixture of compassion and despair. One evening, as the ship neared the coast of France, she struck up a conversation with a young American nurse who had served at a field hospital near the front. The nurse, Sarah, had kind eyes and a weary smile, her face etched with the lines of exhaustion and trauma. "You're going to Amiens?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but tinged with a hint of apprehension. "Yes," Margaret replied. "I have some family business to attend to." Sarah nodded, her gaze drifting towards the darkening horizon.
"It's a changed place," she said.
The war, it left its mark. Not just on the landscape, but on the people. There's a sadness there, a weight that hangs in the air. She paused, then looked directly at Margaret. "Be careful," she said. "There are things that are best left undisturbed. Secrets that are buried for a reason." Sarah's words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. She thought of her father's letter, of the something he had found, the secret he had entrusted to Antoine Dubois. What had he stumbled upon? What danger had he faced? The ship docked at Le Havre, and Margaret took a train to Amiens. The French countryside, once a tapestry of rolling hills and picturesque villages, now bore the scars of war. Fields were pockmarked with shell craters, forests were reduced to skeletal remains, and villages were nothing more than piles of rubble. Amiens itself was a city struggling to recover. Buildings were damaged, streets were filled with debris, and the faces of the people reflected a mixture of resilience and despair. The air was thick with the smell of dust, smoke, and something else, a lingering, almost metallic scent that Margaret couldn't quite place. She found the Rue de la Paix, a narrow, cobbled street lined with shops and cafes. Many of the buildings were damaged, their windows boarded up, their facades scarred with bullet holes. She searched for the address her father had written, her heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. Finally, she found it.
Number 12, Rue de la Paix.
It was a small, unassuming building, its front door painted a faded blue. Above the door, a sign, barely legible, read, A. Dubois Antiquaire, an antique shop. So Antoine Dubois was a dealer in antiques. It made sense, in a way. Her father had always had a passion for history, for objects that held the stories of the past. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What if Antoine Dubois was dead? What if he didn't know anything about her father's secret? What if she was chasing a ghost, a figment of her own desperate longing for connection. But she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far. She had to know the truth. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. A small bell above the door tinkled, announcing her presence. The shop was dimly lit, filled with the musty scent of old books, furniture, and forgotten treasures. And in the back of the room, the faint but distinctive smell that reminded her of a dentist's office. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, thin man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He was older than she had imagined, his face lined with wrinkles, his shoulders slightly stooped. But there was a strength in his gaze, a quiet intensity that reminded her of her father. He also held a dental pick in one hand. "Bonjour, mademoiselle," he said, his voice a low rumble, his accent thick with the sounds of the French countryside, his eyes narrowed on the glint of gold in her pocket. "Can I help you?" The echoes of the psalm seemed to suddenly grow louder, the scent of the battlefield stronger, the weight of the past pressing down on her with an almost physical force. She had found Antoine Dubois, but the journey, she realized, had only just begun. The ticking watch had brought her face to face with the man who might hold the key to the entire war for her. Chapter 5. The Stranger in the Photograph. Antoine Dubois studied Margaret with a gaze that was both curious and cautious. He placed the dental pick carefully on a nearby table, its sharp point glinting in the dim light. The scent of clove oil, a common dental anesthetic, was strong in the air, a surprising detail in an antique shop. I am Margaret Calloway," she said, her French feeling clumsy and inadequate. "The daughter of James Calloway." Dubois's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He gestured for her to sit on a worn velvet armchair, its fabric faded and threadbare. "Mademoiselle Calloway," he said, his voice still low, but with a hint of warmth. "Your father, he spoke of you often. I have been expecting you in a way." He paused, his gaze drifting to the watch in Margaret's hand, which she had unconsciously been clutching. "He told me you would come."
He said you would understand.
Margaret opened her hand, revealing the watch. Dubois leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the cracked face, the frozen hands. "The watch," he said softly. "It has guided you." He reached into a drawer behind the counter and pulled out a small, wooden box. He opened it, revealing a watch identical to Margaret's, except that this one was in perfect condition, its gold casing gleaming, its hands ticking smoothly. Margaret gasped. It was the twin of her father's watch, the one he had mentioned in his letter. "He gave this to me for safekeeping," Dubois explained. "He said it was important, that it held a secret." He picked up the watch and held it out to Margaret. "Take it," he said.
It is yours now.
"Along with the burden that is connected to this one." Margaret hesitated, her fingers hovering over the watch. She felt a strange connection to it, a sense of familiarity, as if she had held it before. "What is the secret, Monsieur Dubois?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did my father find?" Dubois sighed, his gaze drifting to a dusty shelf filled with old books and artifacts. "It is a long story, Mademoiselle Calloway," he said. "A story that began long before the war. A story of discovery, betrayal, and a desperate attempt to protect something of immense power." He walked over to the shelf and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He opened it, revealing faded photographs and handwritten notes. "Your father," he said, "was not just a doctor. He was also a scholar, a historian. He was fascinated by the ancient world, by the legends and myths that had been passed down through the generations." He pointed to a photograph of a group of men, dressed in the uniforms of the British Army, standing in front of a ruined building. Margaret recognized her father, his face younger, but unmistakable. Standing next to him was a man she didn't recognize, a tall, dark-haired man with a stern expression and piercing eyes. "This," Dubois said, "is Captain Alistair Thorne. He was your father's commanding officer and his friend. Or so your father believed." He turned the page, revealing another photograph. This one showed the same ruined building, but from a different angle. In the foreground, a group of men were excavating a section of the ground. "This is where it all began," Dubois said. "In a small village near the Somme." Your father's unit was stationed there, providing medical support for the troops. But they also discovered something hidden beneath the ruins of an ancient church. He paused, his gaze fixed on Margaret's face.
They found a chamber, he said.
A secret chamber, filled with ancient artifacts. And among those artifacts they found it.
It?
Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Du Bois nodded. An object of immense power, he said. An object that could alter the course of history. An object that some believed could even control time itself. He closed the book and looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and warning. Captain Thorne, he said, became obsessed with it. He believed it could be used to win the war, to give the Allies an insurmountable advantage. But your father, he knew it was too dangerous. He knew it had to be protected, kept out of the wrong hands. He picked up the second watch again, his fingers tracing the inscription on the back. These watches, he said, were the key. They were created centuries ago by a secret society dedicated to protecting the object. They are linked, attuned to each other, and to it. He looked at Margaret, his eyes searching hers. Your father believed that you, Margaret, had a special gift, a sensitivity to these things. He believed you could sense the object, could find it, could protect it. But why was he using a dental pick? Margaret blurted out then, instantly, regretting her breach of focus. Du Bois blinked, taken aback. He glanced at the table where he'd laid the instrument.
Ah, that.
Old habits. Before all this, he gestured vaguely around the shop. I was a dentist. A very good one. Your father, he trusted my steady hands. Not just for teeth, but for delicate work, like repairing watches. He smiled, a brief, fleeting expression. And sometimes old soldiers, broken by things worse than shrapnel, needed adjustments. Of a different kind. He tapped his temple. The mind, mademoiselle, is a more fragile mechanism than any clock. The mention of the mind, of fragility, brought Margaret back to the present, to the weight of the two watches, to the stranger in the photograph, Captain Thorne. He was the key, she realized, to understanding her father's secret, to finding the object, to fulfilling the legacy he had left behind. He was also, she suspected, a very dangerous man. The whisper across time had led her to a photograph, a name, and a chilling revelation. Captain Thorne, the friend, the betrayer, the man who coveted an object of unimaginable power. And Margaret, the unsuspecting heir to a battle fought across centuries, was now caught in its deadly crossfire. The two watches were now in her care, and she had no idea where to begin. Chapter 6. Letters from a Ghost. Du Bois's revelation about Captain Thorne and the object of power left Margaret reeling. She felt as though she had stepped into a story far larger and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The quiet antique shop, with its dusty relics and the lingering scent of clove oil, seemed to transform into a gateway to a hidden world of secrets and conspiracies. Captain Thorne, what happened to him? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Du Bois sighed, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if looking back at a past he wished he could forget. He survived the war, he said. But he was changed, obsessed. He disappeared after the armistice. Some say he went searching for the object. Others say he was silenced by those who feared what he might do. He turned back to Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. Your father knew Thorne would come after it, he said. He knew he couldn't stop him alone. That's why he sent me the watch, the letter, and why he entrusted you with this task. He gestured towards a small, locked chest sitting on a shelf behind the counter. Your father left something else for you, he said. Letters. He wrote them during his time at the front, knowing he might not survive. He wanted you to understand everything. He retrieved the chest and placed it on the counter. It was made of dark wood, bound with iron straps, and secured with a heavy padlock. Du Bois produced a small key from a chain around his neck. This is the key, he said. Your father gave it to me, along with the watch. He said only you should open it. Margaret took the key, her hand trembling. It felt cold and heavy, a tangible link to her father, to the secrets he had carried. She inserted the key into the padlock and turned. The lock clicked open, and she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were stacks of letters, tied together with ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakably her father's. They were addressed to her, spanning the years of his service, from his initial excitement and optimism to his growing disillusionment and fear. She picked up the first letter, dated September 1916, and began to read. Her father's voice, so familiar and yet so distant, filled the room. He wrote of his life in the medical corps, of the camaraderie he had found with his fellow soldiers, of the challenges and rewards of tending to the wounded. As she read through the letters, a picture began to emerge, not just of her father's experiences, but of his evolving understanding of the war and of the secret he had stumbled upon. He wrote of his growing friendship with Captain Thorne, of their shared interest in history and archaeology, of their discovery of the ancient chamber. He described the object in detail, as best he could. He called it the Chronos Stone, a name he'd found in an ancient text discovered within the chamber. He wrote of its strange properties, of its ability to seemingly manipulate time, to create distortions and anomalies. He also wrote of his growing unease, of his suspicions about Captain Thorne's motives. He described Thorne's increasing obsession with the Chronos Stone, his belief that it could be used as a weapon, his disregard for the potential consequences. The later letters were filled with fear and desperation. He wrote of his attempts to hide the Chronos Stone, to keep it out of Thorne's reach. He described the growing danger, the sense of being watched, of being hunted. The final letter, dated just days before his death, was the most chilling. My dearest Margaret, I fear this may be my last letter. Thorne knows. He knows about the watches, about the connection.
He is coming for me.
I have done everything I can to protect the Chronos Stone, to ensure it doesn't fall into his hands. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. But I have faith in you, my daughter. You have the strength, the courage, the intuition to finish what I started. You must find the Chronos Stone. You must protect it. The fate of the world may depend on it. Remember, Margaret, time is not always what it seems. Trust your instincts. Trust the watch. And trust the love that binds us, even across the veil of death. Always, your father. Margaret finished reading the letter, tears streaming down her face. Her father's words, written in the shadow of death, were a testament to his love, his courage, and his unwavering belief in her. He had entrusted her with a mission of immense importance, a mission that could determine the course of history. She looked at the two watches, the one on her wrist, the one Du Bois had given her. They were more than just timepieces. They were weapons, tools, guides. They were the key to finding the Chronos Stone, to stopping Captain Thorne, to fulfilling her father's legacy. What do I do now, Monsieur Du Bois? She asked, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Du Bois smiled, a faint, knowing smile. You follow the clues, Mademoiselle Calloway, he said. You follow the whispers of time. The watches, they will guide you. They will lead you to the Chronos Stone. And they will lead you to him. He pointed to the photograph of Captain Thorne, his face a mask of cold ambition. But be warned, he said. Thorne is a dangerous man. He will stop at nothing to achieve his goals. He has allies, resources, and a ruthlessness that knows no bounds. He paused, his gaze meeting Margaret's. You are not alone, Mademoiselle Calloway, he said. There are others who know the truth, who are willing to help. But you must be careful. You must trust no one completely. The letters from a ghost had given her a purpose, a mission, a burden. She was no longer just a grieving daughter, searching for answers. She was a warrior, armed with her father's love and the power of the two watches, ready to face the shadows of the past and the dangers of the present. The ticking was no longer just a sound, but marching orders. Chapter 7. The Rendezvous at Dawn. Du Bois's warning about trusting no one echoed in Margaret's mind as she left the antique shop, the chest of letters clutched tightly in her arms. The streets of Amiens seemed darker, more menacing, filled with unseen eyes and hidden dangers. She found a small, inexpensive hotel near the railway station, a place where she hoped she could blend in unnoticed. The room was cramped and sparsely furnished, but it had a lock on the door and a window overlooking a quiet courtyard. She spent the evening poring over her father's letters again, searching for any clue, any detail that might help her in her quest. She focused on the descriptions of the Chrono Stone, on the ancient chamber, on Captain Thorne's obsession. She realized that her father hadn't revealed the exact location of the Chrono Stone. He'd been careful, knowing that his letters might fall into the wrong hands. But he had left hints, subtle references to places and events that might lead her to it. One phrase, repeated several times in his letters, caught her attention: the place where the three rivers meet. Margaret knew that Amiens was situated on the Somme River, but she didn't know of any other rivers nearby. She needed a map, a detailed map of the region, one that might show the location her father was referring to. She decided to return to Dubois's shop in the morning. He was her only contact, her only source of information, and she hoped he might be able to provide her with the map she needed. But she also remembered his warning, his caution about trusting anyone completely. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was following her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her senses on high alert. The city, still recovering from the war, felt like a labyrinth of secrets and shadows, a place where danger lurked around every corner. As darkness fell, she decided to try an experiment. She took the two watches, her father's and the one Dubois had given her, and placed them side by side on the small table next to her bed. She focused her attention on them, closing her eyes and trying to clear her mind of all distractions. She remembered her father's words. Trust the watch. She whispered the phrase over and over like a mantra. And then, slowly, she began to feel it. A faint vibration, a subtle hum, emanating from the watches. It was as if they were communicating with each other, resonating with a hidden energy. She opened her eyes and looked at the watches. The hands on both were moving, not in their usual way, but in a strange, synchronized pattern. They were pointing like compass needles towards the window, towards the east. Margaret felt a surge of excitement. The watches were guiding her, just as her father had said. They were leading her towards something, towards the Chrono Stone, towards the next clue in her quest. She realized she couldn't wait for morning. The pull of the watches, the sense of urgency, was too strong. She needed to follow their guidance, to see where they would lead her. She dressed quickly, putting on a dark coat and a hat that concealed her face. She slipped the two watches into her pocket, their faint vibration a constant reminder of their presence. She left the hotel, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were deserted, the only sound the distant echo of a church bell. She followed the direction the watches had indicated, walking east, towards the outskirts of the city. As she walked, she noticed a figure following her, keeping a distance, but always there, a shadow in the darkness. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. Was it Thorne? Or one of his allies? She reached the edge of the city, where the buildings gave way to open fields and the dark silhouette of a forest. The watches were vibrating more intensely now, pulling her towards a specific point in the distance.
She saw it then.
A small, stone bridge, spanning a narrow stream. And beyond the bridge, the confluence of three rivers, their waters shimmering in the moonlight. The place where the three rivers meet. This was it. This was the location her father had referred to. But what was she supposed to find here? As she approached the bridge, the figure following her emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in a dark cloak, her face hidden by a hood. Margaret stopped, her hand reaching for the watches in her pocket. Was this an enemy or an ally? The woman spoke, her voice low and husky, but with a distinct American accent. Margaret Calloway? Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on the woman's face, trying to discern her intentions. My name is Isabella Moreau, the woman said. Your father, he sent me. He said you might need help. She pulled back her hood, revealing a face that was both beautiful and hardened, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, a mark that seemed to speak of a past filled with danger and hardship. He said you would be carrying a watch. Two, actually, she continued. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then took the watches from her pocket. Isabella's eyes widened slightly as she saw them. "He told me to meet you here," she said. "At dawn." He said this is where it all began. And this is where it must end. The rendezvous at dawn was not what Margaret had expected. A mysterious woman, an ally sent by her father, a meeting at the place where the three rivers met. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was still unclear, filled with danger and uncertainty. The ticking of the watches had now led her to a new player in the story and a new location, but at what cost? The sunrise cast long shadows on the three converging rivers, the figures of the two women, reflected in the black, endless water. Chapter 8. Beneath the gaslight's glare. Isabella Moreau. The name resonated with a faint familiarity, a whisper from Margaret's past. Had her father mentioned her in his letters? She couldn't recall, but there was something about the woman, about her presence, that felt both reassuring and unsettling. The dawn was breaking, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, casting a soft glow over the three rivers and the ancient stone bridge. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant murmur of the flowing water. How did you know my father?" Margaret asked, her voice still guarded, her hand instinctively clutching the watches in her pocket. Isabella smiled, a brief, fleeting expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We worked together," she said. "During the war. I was a courier. I carried messages, information, sometimes other things." She paused, her gaze drifting towards a bridge, towards the place where the three rivers met. "Your father trusted me," she said. "He knew I could be discreet, resourceful. He knew I shared his concerns." She turned back to Margaret, her eyes searching hers. "He told me about the Chrono Stone," she said. "About Captain Thorne. About the danger you would be facing." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "He gave me this," she said. "A map. He said it would lead you to the chamber, to the place where the Chrono Stone is hidden." Margaret took the map, her fingers trembling. It was drawn in her father's handwriting, a detailed sketch of the area surrounding the three rivers. There were markings, symbols, and annotations in French and Latin. "He said the entrance to the chamber is concealed," Isabella explained. "It's hidden beneath the bridge, in a secret passage that can only be accessed at a specific time, under specific conditions." She pointed to a symbol on the map, a circle with three lines radiating outwards. "This represents the three rivers," she said. "And this is the key." She pointed to another symbol, a small crescent moon, positioned above the circle. "The entrance will only open," she said, "during the new moon, when the tide is at its lowest point. And when the watches are aligned." Margaret looked at the watches in her hand. She understood now. The synchronized movement, the pointing towards the east, the vibration, it was all leading to this. To this specific place, this specific time, this specific condition. But there was something else, something that troubled her. Isabella had said the entrance would open when the watches are aligned. What did that mean? How do we align the watches?" Margaret asked. Isabella smiled again, that same fleeting, enigmatic smile. "That," she said, "is something you must figure out for yourself, Margaret. Your father believed you had a gift, a connection to the watches, to the Chrono Stone. He believed you could sense it, could feel it." She then gestured for Margaret to follow her, underneath the bridge. It was damp, cold, and the sound of running water was amplified by the stone. Isabella took out a small, gas-powered lantern, igniting it. She stepped closer to Margaret, the gaslight flickering, casting long, dancing shadows on their faces. "Your father was a brilliant man, Margaret," she said. "But he was also naive. He underestimated Thorne. He underestimated the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men." She paused, her gaze fixed on Margaret's. "Thorne is not the only one who seeks the Chrono Stone," she said. "There are others. Powerful forces, ancient societies, who have been searching for it for centuries. They know about you, Margaret. They know about the watches. And they will stop at nothing to get them." Her words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. The danger was far greater than she had imagined. She was not just facing a rogue captain, but a network of hidden enemies, a conspiracy that spanned centuries. She studied the walls and the space under the bridge. There were markings on the wall. She held the two watches near, their pulse picking up a strong rhythm. The watches.
The key.
The alignment. She had to trust her instincts, to follow the guidance of the watches, to unlock the secret of the chamber. Isabella watched, her expression unreadable, as she positioned the lantern to focus on the area that Margaret seemed to be studying. The ticking of the watches grew steadier, almost harmonious. The gaslight's glare revealed a hidden world beneath the bridge, a world of ancient secrets and looming dangers. Margaret was no longer just following her father's footsteps. She was stepping into a battleground, a conflict that had been raging for centuries, a conflict that could determine the fate of time itself. The new moon was approaching, the tide was receding, and the watches were calling to her, urging her to unlock the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface. The three rivers held their breath. Chapter 9. The Price of Truth. The markings on the wall beneath the bridge were subtle, almost invisible in the dim light of Isabella's gas lantern. They were ancient symbols, similar to the ones on her father's map, a mixture of Celtic and Romantic designs, etched into the stone centuries ago. Margaret traced the symbols with her fingertips, feeling a faint vibration, a resonance, with the watches in her pocket. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind, to focus on the connection, to understand the message the symbols were trying to convey. She remembered her father's words, "Trust your instincts. Trust the watch." She opened her eyes and looked at the watches. Their hands were moving, not in their usual circular motion, but in a series of short, precise movements, pointing to different symbols on the wall. It was as if they were guiding her, showing her the sequence, the combination. "The alignment," Margaret whispered. "It's a code. A sequence of symbols that must be activated in the correct order." Isabella watched her, her expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Can you decipher it?"
she asked.
Margaret nodded, her mind racing. She began to touch the symbols on the wall, following the guidance of the watches, pressing them in a specific order. As she touched each symbol, she felt a faint click, a subtle shift in the stone. The air grew colder. The sound of the flowing water seemed to intensify. The watches were vibrating more strongly now, their ticking almost deafening. Suddenly, a section of the wall began to move, sliding inwards with a low, grinding sound. A dark opening appeared, revealing a narrow passage leading down into the earth. The chamber. Her father's secret chamber. The place where the chronostone was hidden. Margaret felt a surge of excitement, mixed with a growing sense of trepidation. She had found the entrance, had unlocked the secret, but what awaited her inside? Isabella stepped forward, her gas lantern casting a flickering light into the darkness. "Be careful, Margaret," she said. "We don't know what's down there." Or who. They descended into the passage, the stone wall closing behind them with a resounding thud. The air was thick and musty, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, a strange, metallic odor, similar to the one Margaret had noticed in Dubois's shop, but stronger, more pungent. The passage sloped downwards, twisting and turning, leading them deeper and deeper into the earth. The only light came from Isabella's lantern, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They reached a large, circular chamber, its walls lined with ancient carvings and inscriptions. In the center of the chamber, on a stone pedestal, rested a small, crystalline object. The chronostone. It glowed with an ethereal light, pulsating with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a living heart. It was smaller than Margaret had imagined, no bigger than her fist, but it radiated an immense power, a sense of ancient mystery and unimaginable potential. Margaret felt drawn to it, captivated by its beauty and its power. She reached out her hand, her fingers hovering over the surface of the stone. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, a cold, menacing voice that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. "So, you found it." They turned to see Captain Thorne standing at the entrance of the chamber, his face obscured by the shadows. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, his face etched with the lines of obsession and cruelty. He held a gun in his hand, pointed directly at Margaret. I knew you would lead me to it, Miss Calloway, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Your father was a fool, but he was also predictable. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the chrono stone. For years I've searched for this, he said. For years I've dreamed of its power. And now it's mine. He turned his attention to Isabella, his eyes narrowing. You, he said, his voice filled with contempt. I should have known you'd be involved. The treacherous little courier. Always playing both sides. Isabella stood her ground, her hand reaching inside her cloak. You won't get away with this, Thorn, she said. The chrono stone is not yours to control. Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the chamber. We'll see about that, he said. He raised his gun, aiming it at Margaret. Give me the watches, Miss Calloway, he said, and I might let you live. Margaret hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't give him the watches. She knew he would use the chrono stone for his own twisted purposes, to rewrite history, to unleash chaos upon the world. But she also knew that if she didn't comply, he would kill her. And Isabella. She looked at Isabella, her eyes pleading for guidance. Isabella nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Margaret took the watches from her pocket and held them out to Thorn. He reached for them, his fingers brushing against hers. In that instant, Isabella moved. She pulled a small, silver knife from her cloak and lunged at Thorn, striking him in the arm. The gun went off, the bullet grazing Margaret's shoulder. The sound echoed through the chamber, deafening and disorienting. Thorn roared in pain, dropping the gun. He stumbled backwards, clutching his wounded arm. Isabella attacked again, her knife flashing in the dim light. Thorn fought back, his desperation fueled by his obsession. Margaret, stunned and disoriented, staggered towards the pedestal, towards the chrono stone. She knew she had to do something to stop Thorn, to protect the object from falling into his hands. She reached out and touched the chrono stone, her fingers closing around its smooth, crystalline surface. A surge of energy coursed through her body, a feeling of immense power and overwhelming knowledge. She felt a connection to the stone, to the watches, to the flow of time itself. As Thorn overpowered Isabella, throwing her against the stone wall, Margaret held on, watching the scene playing out in slow motion. She saw Thorn raise his fist to strike Isabella again, his face contorted with rage. And then, without thinking, she acted. She focused her will, her intention on the chrono stone, on the watches, on the flow of time. She willed Thorn to stop, to freeze, to be trapped in a moment, unable to move, unable to harm. And it happened. Thorn froze, mid-strike, his body rigid, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He was trapped, suspended in time, a living statue. The chamber fell silent. The only sound the faint hum of the chrono stone, the steady ticking of the watches. Margaret stood there, trembling, her body drained of energy, her mind reeling from what she had just done. She had used the power of the chrono stone. She had controlled time. But at what cost? The truth she had sought had come at a terrible price. A bullet wound, a betrayal, a confrontation with a madman, and the terrifying realization that she now held the power to alter time itself. The watches had led her to this moment, to this choice, to this burden. She now had to decide what to do with it. The ticking was a heavy responsibility. Chapter 10. A Dance with the Past. The silence in the chamber was broken only by Isabella's ragged breathing and the faint, rhythmic pulse of the chrono stone. Margaret stood frozen, her hand still resting on the crystalline surface, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what she had just done. She had stopped time, trapped Thorn in a moment, a feat that defied logic and reason. Isabella slowly got to her feet, her face pale, her arm bruised where Thorn had thrown her against the wall. She looked at Margaret, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and fear. You did it, she whispered. You controlled it. Margaret couldn't speak. She felt drained, exhausted, as if all her energy had been siphoned away by the chrono stone. She looked at Thorn, his body suspended in midair, his face contorted in a silent scream. It was a grotesque, unsettling sight.
What do we do now?
Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Margaret didn't know. She had never intended to use the Chrono Stone, to wield its power. She had only wanted to protect it, to keep it out of Thorn's hands. But now, she was faced with a choice, a responsibility she hadn't anticipated. She looked at the two watches, still ticking steadily on her wrist, and in her other hand. They were the key, she realized, not just to finding the Chrono Stone, but to controlling it. They were the conduits, the instruments that allowed her to tap into its power. She remembered her father's words, "Time is not always what it seems." What if she could use the Chrono Stone to change things? To go back, to prevent the tragedies of the past, to save her father's life? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. The power to alter the past, to rewrite history, was a temptation almost impossible to resist. But she also knew the dangers, the potential consequences of tampering with time. "Isabella," Margaret said, her voice hoarse, Can we use this to go back? To change things?" Isabella looked at her, her eyes widening in alarm.
"Margaret, no," she said.
"It's too dangerous.
We don't know what the consequences might be."
We could unravel the fabric of reality, create paradoxes, unleash chaos. But Margaret was already lost in thought, her mind racing with possibilities. She imagined going back to that fateful day on the Somme, warning her father about Thorn, preventing his death. She imagined a world where the war had ended differently, where millions of lives had been spared. She looked at the Chrono Stone, its ethereal light pulsating with a hypnotic rhythm. It was calling to her, tempting her, offering her the chance to rewrite her own history, to erase the pain and grief that had haunted her for years. "I have to try," Margaret said, her voice filled with a desperate, almost reckless determination. "I have to save him." Isabella grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Margaret, listen to me," she said. "You can't play God. You can't control time. It's not ours to manipulate." But Margaret was beyond reason. She was consumed by the possibility, by the hope of seeing her father again, of changing the past. She focused her will on the Chrono Stone, on the watches, on the specific date she wanted to return to, July 28, 1918, the day before her father's death. She felt a surge of energy, a dizzying sensation, as if the world around her was dissolving, melting away. The chamber began to spin, the walls blurring, the light of the Chrono Stone growing brighter, more intense. Isabella screamed, her voice echoing in the swirling vortex of time. "Margaret, stop. You don't know what you're doing." But it was too late. Margaret had crossed the threshold, had stepped into the river of time, carrying the Chrono Stone and the watches with her, embarking on a perilous journey into the past. She found herself standing in a muddy field, surrounded by the sounds of war. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and death. She saw soldiers huddled in trenches, their faces grim and exhausted. She heard the distant rumble of artillery fire, the screams of the wounded, the cries of the dying. She was in the Somme. In 1918. She had done it. She had traveled back in time. But she had also made a terrible mistake. She hadn't just transported herself. She had brought Thorn with her. He was still frozen, still suspended in time, but he was here, in the past, a ticking time bomb waiting to be unleashed. And she had no idea how to control him, how to send him back, how to undo what she had done. She was trapped, stranded in a war zone, with a frozen madman and the power to alter history, a power she didn't understand, a power she couldn't control. The dance with the past had begun, and Margaret was caught in its chaotic, unpredictable rhythm, with no idea where it would lead her or what the consequences would be. She was lost, with a man frozen in time, as the constant sounds of battle reminded her of her folly. The ticking of the watches was now a mocking reminder of her terrible decision. Chapter 11. The Unsent Telegram. The chaos of the Somme in 1918 enveloped Margaret like a suffocating shroud. The sounds of war, the screams of the wounded, the stench of death and decay, it was a sensory overload, a nightmare made real. She stood there, paralyzed by fear and regret, clutching the Chronos stone and the watches, Thorn's frozen figure a constant, terrifying reminder of her reckless act. She had to find her father. She had to warn him about Thorn, about the danger he posed. But she had no idea where to begin. She didn't know where his unit was stationed, how to navigate the treacherous landscape of the war zone, how to avoid being captured or killed. She stumbled through the muddy field, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She saw soldiers, their faces grim and weary, their uniforms stained with blood and mud. She saw stretcher-bearers carrying the wounded, their faces etched with pain and exhaustion. She approached a young soldier, his arm bandaged, his eyes filled with a haunted look. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "can you help me? I'm looking for my father, Dr. James Calloway. He's with the medical corps." The soldier stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "A woman?"
he said.
"Here? At the front? You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." He paused, then looked at her more closely.
"Calloway," he said.
"I know that name. He's with the 16th Field Ambulance. They're stationed near the village of." He stopped abruptly, his name lost in the sudden burst of a close explosion that shook the ground. Margaret was thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. She lay there, dazed and disoriented, the sounds of war swirling around her. When she finally managed to sit up, the young soldier was gone, vanished. She was alone again, lost in the chaos of the battlefield. She had a name, a unit, but no idea how to find them. She continued to wander, her clothes torn and muddy, her body aching. She saw horrors she could never have imagined, scenes of carnage and suffering that would haunt her nightmares forever. She finally stumbled upon a makeshift field hospital, a collection of tents and makeshift shelters, overflowing with wounded and dying soldiers. The air was thick with the smell of blood, antiseptic, and the cries of men in agony. She searched frantically for her father, her heart pounding with a desperate hope. She asked the nurses, the orderlies, anyone she could find, if they knew Dr. Calloway. Finally, a weary nurse pointed her towards a large tent at the far end of the camp.
"Dr. Calloway," she said.
"He's in there, but he's busy. We've had a lot of casualties." Margaret rushed towards the tent, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and trepidation. She pushed aside the flap and stepped inside. The scene that greeted her was overwhelming. The tent was filled with wounded soldiers, lying on stretchers and cots, their bodies mangled and broken. The air was thick with the sounds of groaning and the frantic activity of the medical staff. And there, in the center of the tent, she saw him. Her father. He was older than she remembered, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with exhaustion. But it was him.
Alive.
He was working on a wounded soldier, his hands moving with a practiced skill, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't notice her at first, too absorbed in his task. Margaret stood there, frozen, tears streaming down her face. She had found him. She had come back in time, had defied the laws of nature, to see him again. But what was she going to do? How was she going to warn him about Thorn, about the danger he posed, without revealing the truth about her journey, about the Chronos stone? She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Father?" she said, her voice trembling. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening in surprise. "Margaret?"
he said.
What are you doing here? This is no place for you." He looked around, confused, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "How did you get here?" he asked. "It's too dangerous." Margaret struggled to find the words. She couldn't tell him the truth. He wouldn't believe her. He'd think she was mad. I had to see you," she said. I had a feeling, a premonition, that you were in danger." She pulled out a crumpled, unsent telegram from her pocket, one she'd found tucked away in her father's belongings back in New York, a draft of a message he'd never sent to Eleanor, filled with anxieties about Thorn and the discovery. She'd carried it with her, a desperate, illogical talisman. "I found this," she lied, her voice shaking. "In your things."
It worried me.
"I had to come." He took the telegram, his brow furrowed as he read it. His expression changed from confusion to concern, then to a dawning understanding. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, "you shouldn't have come. But perhaps it was meant to be." The unsent telegram, a forgotten piece of paper, had become the bridge, the explanation, the justification for her presence. It was a lie, but it was a lie that might save his life. And now, she had to find a way to use this opportunity, to warn him about Thorn, without revealing the impossible truth. The ticking of the 2 watches was a constant reminder of the precariousness of her situation, of the fragile balance of time she had disrupted. The psalm was waiting. Chapter 12. Scars of the Battlefield. The field hospital tent was a maelstrom of activity, a constant flow of wounded soldiers, frantic medical staff, and the ever-present stench of blood and antiseptic. Margaret stood beside her father, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. She was here in the past with him, but the danger was real, immediate, and the clock, quite literally, was ticking. "Father," she said, her voice low, trying to keep the conversation private amidst the chaos, "that telegram you mentioned Captain Thorn.
You said you were worried about him."
James Calloway sighed, his gaze drifting towards the entrance of the tent, as if expecting Thorn to appear at any moment. "Thorn," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and suspicion. "He's changed. He's become obsessed with something we found. Something dangerous." He looked at Margaret, his eyes searching hers. "I can't explain it all now," he said. "It's too complicated. But you must trust me. Thorn is not the man I thought he was. He's capable of anything." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. She wanted to tell him everything, to reveal the truth about the Chronos Stone, about Thorn's future actions, about his death. But she knew she couldn't. It would be too much, too unbelievable. "Father," she said, "just be careful. Don't trust him. Don't let him out of your sight." James Calloway smiled, a faint, weary smile. "I appreciate your concern, Margaret," he said. "But I'm a soldier. I know how to take care of myself." He reached out and touched her cheek, his hand rough and calloused. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "It's too dangerous. I need to get you back to safety, back to your mother." Margaret's heart sank. She knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. She had to find a way to stop Thorn, to prevent the events that would lead to her father's death. "Father," she said, "I can help. I'm a trained nurse. I volunteered at the hospital in New York. I can assist you here." James Calloway hesitated, his eyes filled with concern. "Margaret, this is not New York," he said. "This is a war zone. It's brutal. I don't want you to see this." But Margaret was insistent. She knew she had to stay, to be close to her father, to protect him. "Please, Father," she said. "Let me help. I can be useful." He finally relented, his reluctance evident in his sigh. "All right, Margaret," he said. "But you must promise me you'll be careful. You'll stay close to me. And you'll do exactly as I say." Margaret nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She had bought herself some time, a chance to stay close to her father, to monitor Thorn, to try to prevent the tragedy that she knew was coming. She spent the next few hours working alongside her father, tending to the wounded, assisting with surgeries, witnessing the horrors of war firsthand. The sheer scale of human suffering was overwhelming, the constant stream of mangled bodies, the cries of pain, the stench of death. She saw a different side of her father, a side she had never known before. He was tireless, dedicated, compassionate, working tirelessly to save lives, to alleviate suffering, to bring a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. But she also saw the toll the war was taking on him. The exhaustion in his eyes, the lines of worry etched on his face, the constant tension in his body. He was carrying a heavy burden, the weight of responsibility for the lives of his patients, the fear of the unknown, the constant threat of danger. And she saw Thorn. He was there, in the camp, moving among the soldiers, his presence a constant, menacing shadow. He was watching her father, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating intensity. Margaret tried to avoid him, to stay out of his sight, but it was impossible. He seemed to be everywhere, always lurking, always watching. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Margaret found herself alone with her father, sitting outside the tent, sharing a meager meal of bread and cheese. "Father," she said, "that object, the one you mentioned in your telegram. What is it? Where is it?" James Calloway looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of caution and reluctance. "It's complicated, Margaret," he said. "It's something I can't fully explain. Something ancient. Powerful." He paused, then looked around, as if to make sure they were alone.
"Thorn wants it," he said.
"He believes it can be used as a weapon. He believes it can win the war." He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's too dangerous, Margaret," he said. "It's not meant to be used. It's meant to be protected." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather pouch. "I've hidden it," he said. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere Thorn won't find it." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. He was talking about the chronostone. He had it. He was protecting it. But where had he hidden it? And how could she ensure that Thorn wouldn't find it? The scars of the battlefield were not just physical. They were etched on her father's soul, on her own, on the very fabric of time itself. She was trapped in a web of secrets and lies, surrounded by danger, with the fate of her father, and perhaps the world, hanging in the balance. The two watches ticked ominously, counting down to a confrontation she knew was inevitable. Chapter 13. The Betrayal at Amiens. The tension in the camp was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on everyone. Margaret felt it in the hurried movements of the medical staff, in the strained conversations of the soldiers, in the constant, underlying fear that hung in the air. She knew that Thorn was planning something, that he was getting closer to finding the chronostone, and that her father's life was in imminent danger. She tried to stay close to her father, to watch over him, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. He was constantly busy, tending to the endless stream of wounded, and Thorn was always lurking, always watching, his presence a constant threat. One evening, Margaret overheard a conversation between her father and another officer, a Major Davies, a man she knew her father trusted. They were discussing the chronostone, the danger it posed, and the need to move it to a safer location. "I've arranged for a transfer," Major Davies said. "A courier will be arriving tomorrow morning. They'll take it to Amiens, to a secure location."
Amiens.
The name sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. It was where Du Bois was, where the other watch was, where the whole story had begun. "Are you sure it's safe, Major?" her father asked, his voice filled with concern. "Thorn is desperate. He'll stop at nothing to get his hands on it." "We've taken precautions, James," Major Davies replied. "The courier is reliable. The route is secure. No one knows about it except us." But Margaret knew. And she had a terrible feeling that Thorn knew, too. She had to warn them. She had to stop the transfer, to prevent Thorn from intercepting the chronostone. She tried to talk to her father, to convince him to postpone the transfer, but he was adamant. He believed it was the only way to keep the chronostone safe, to get it out of Thorn's reach. "Margaret, I know you're worried," he said. "But this is the best course of action. We have to trust Major Davies. He knows what he's doing." Margaret felt helpless, trapped by her own deception, unable to reveal the truth about Thorn, about the future, about the danger that awaited them. The next morning, the courier arrived. A young woman, disguised as a Red Cross nurse, her face pale and determined. Margaret recognized her instantly.
It was Isabella.
Isabella. In 1918. Margaret's mind reeled. How was this possible? Had Isabella also traveled back in time? Or was this a younger version of the woman she had met in Amiens, a woman who was somehow involved in her father's secret, even before Margaret was born? She watched as her father entrusted the leather pouch containing the chronostone to Isabella, his instructions brief and urgent. "Take this to Antoine Du Bois in Amiens," he said.
"He'll know what to do."
"He's expecting you." Isabella nodded, her eyes meeting Margaret's for a brief, fleeting moment. There was a flicker of recognition, a hint of understanding, in her gaze. As Isabella left the camp, Margaret felt a surge of despair. She knew what was going to happen. She knew that Thorn was waiting, that he would intercept Isabella, that he would steal the Chronos Stone. She had to do something. She had to stop him. She ran after Isabella, ignoring the shouts of the soldiers, the warnings of her father. She had to catch up to her, to warn her, to prevent the betrayal that she knew was coming. She followed Isabella through the muddy fields, towards the road that led to Amiens. She saw Thorn, waiting in the distance, his figure silhouetted against the morning sky. He was with a group of soldiers, their faces grim and determined. "Isabella, stop!" Margaret cried out. "It's a trap." But it was too late. Thorn and his men surrounded Isabella, their weapons drawn. They seized the leather pouch, their movements swift and brutal. Margaret watched in horror as Thorn ripped open the pouch, revealing the Chronos Stone. He held it up, his face contorted with a mixture of triumph and madness. "I have it!" he cried out. "The power is mine." He turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with a cold, cruel light. "Thank you, Miss Calloway," he said. "You've been most helpful." He raised his hand, signaling to his men. They grabbed Isabella, their grip tight and unforgiving. "Take her," Thorn said, "and get rid of her." Margaret screamed, running towards them, desperate to save Isabella, to retrieve the Chronos Stone. But Thorn's men were too strong, too numerous. They overpowered her, dragging her back, forcing her to watch as they led Isabella away, towards the darkness of the nearby woods. She heard a single gunshot, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the battlefield. And then silence. Margaret collapsed to the ground, her body racked with sobs. She had failed. She had failed to save Isabella, to protect the Chronos Stone, to prevent the betrayal that had sealed her father's fate. The betrayal at Amiens was complete. Thorn had the Chronos Stone, Isabella was dead, and Margaret was left alone, stranded in the past, with the knowledge of a future she could no longer prevent. The two watches ticked mockingly, their rhythm a constant reminder of her failure, of the irreversible damage she had done to the fabric of time. She had nothing. Chapter 14. The Woman in Black. The world seemed to crumble around Margaret. The gunshot that had taken Isabella's life echoed in her mind, a constant, agonizing reminder of her failure. She lay there, in the mud and the blood of the psalm, her body racked with sobs, her spirit broken. She had tried to change the past, to save her father, to prevent the tragedy that had defined her life. But she had only made things worse. She had caused Isabella's death, had given Thorn the Chronos Stone, and had sealed her father's fate. She wanted to give up, to succumb to the despair that threatened to consume her. But she couldn't. She had to find a way to fix this, to undo the damage she had done, to save her father, even if it meant sacrificing herself. She slowly got to her feet, her body aching, her clothes torn and muddy. She looked around, her eyes searching the battlefield for any sign of Thorn, of the Chronos Stone, of a way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing. Only the endless expanse of mud and trenches, the distant rumble of artillery fire, the constant reminder of the war that raged around her. She started to walk, aimlessly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose. She had to find her father. She had to tell him what had happened, to warn him about Thorn, even if he wouldn't believe her. She returned to the field hospital, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. She found her father in the tent, working tirelessly on a wounded soldier, his face etched with exhaustion and grief. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in surprise and concern.
"Margaret," he said.
"What happened? Where have you been?" She couldn't speak. The words caught in her throat, choked by the tears that streamed down her face. He rushed to her side, his hands gently touching her face, her arms, searching for injuries. "Margaret, are you hurt?" he asked. "Tell me what happened." She finally managed to speak, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Isabella," she said. "Thorn, he killed her. He took the Chronos Stone." Her father's face paled. He staggered back, as if he had been struck.
"What?" he said.
"That's impossible," Major Davies assured me. He stopped, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. Davies, he whispered. He betrayed me. He was working with Thorn all along. Margaret nodded, her tears flowing freely. I tried to stop them, Father, she said. But I was too late. James Calloway stood there, frozen, his body trembling. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief, guilt, and a terrifying realization. Margaret, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What have you done? He knew. Somehow he knew. He had sensed the truth, the impossible truth about her journey, about the Chronos Stone, about the alteration of time. Before Margaret could answer, a commotion erupted outside the tent. Soldiers rushed in, their faces grim and determined. Dr. Calloway, one of them said, you're under arrest. For treason. Margaret's heart sank. Thorn had acted quickly, framing her father for his own crimes, using his influence and the chaos of the war to cover his tracks. They dragged her father away, ignoring his protests, his pleas of innocence. Margaret tried to intervene, to stop them, but they pushed her aside, their movements brutal and efficient. She watched as they took her father away, his figure disappearing into the darkness, leaving her alone, stranded in the chaos of the war. She was utterly alone, without allies, without resources, with only the 2 watches ticking mockingly on her wrists, reminders of her catastrophic failure. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman dressed in black, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She approached Margaret, her movements silent and graceful. Margaret Calloway? She said, her voice low and husky, but with a familiar accent. French, but with an undertone of something else, something she couldn't quite place. Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on the woman's face, trying to discern her intentions. My name is Seraphine Dubois, the woman said. Antoine Dubois was my brother. He sent me to find you. She pulled back the brim of her hat, revealing a face that was both beautiful and haunting, her eyes filled with a deep sadness, but also with a fierce determination. She looked strikingly like Isabella. Isabella, she was my sister, Seraphine said, her voice trembling slightly. I know what happened. I know what Thorn has done. She reached out and touched Margaret's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. It's not over, Margaret, she said. We can still stop him. We can still save your father. She paused, her gaze meeting Margaret's. But we must act quickly, she said. Time is running out. The woman in black, Seraphine Dubois, a sister of both Antoine and Isabella, a figure emerging from the shadows of loss and betrayal. She was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness, a promise of redemption. But could Margaret trust her? Could she trust anyone in this treacherous, time-twisted world? The ticking of the watches was now a shared burden, a call to action. Chapter 15. A stolen moment in time. Seraphine Dubois. The name echoed with a resonance that went beyond mere familiarity. She was the sister of Antoine, the clockmaker, and Isabella, the courier. A family bound by secrets, by loyalty, and by a shared struggle against the darkness that Thorn represented. Seraphine led Margaret away from the field hospital, away from the chaos and the danger, towards a small, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. It was a secluded, hidden place, a temporary refuge from the storm that raged around them. Inside the farmhouse, Seraphine lit a small oil lamp, casting a flickering glow over the dusty, sparsely furnished room. She produced a bottle of water and some bread, offering them to Margaret, who accepted gratefully, her body aching, her spirit weary. How did you find me? Margaret asked, her voice hoarse.
Seraphine smiled. A faint, sad smile.
Antoine has ways, she said. He has contacts, informants, people who owe him favors. He knew you were in danger. He sent me to protect you. She paused, her gaze drifting towards a window, as if listening for something. Isabella, she was more than just a courier, Seraphine said. She was a skilled fighter, a resourceful agent. She had been working with your father for years, helping him to protect the Chronos Stone. She turned back to Margaret, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and anger. Thorn, he underestimated her, she said. He thought she was just a messenger. He didn't know her strength, her determination. She paused again, her voice dropping to a whisper. But he also underestimated you, Margaret, she said. He doesn't know your power, your connection to the watches, to the chronostone. Margaret looked at the 2 watches on her wrists, their ticking a constant reminder of the burden she carried, of the power she had wielded, and of the terrible consequences of her actions. I made a mistake, Seraphine, she said. I tried to change the past. I caused Isabella's death. I gave Thorn the chronostone. Seraphine shook her head. It's not your fault, Margaret, she said. You were trying to save your father. You were acting out of love, out of desperation. She reached out and touched Margaret's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. We all make mistakes, she said. But it's what we do afterwards that matters. We can still fix this, Margaret. We can still stop Thorn. She pulled out a map from her bag, a detailed map of the region, similar to the one her father had drawn. Thorn will be taking the chronostone to Amiens, she said. To a place he believes is secure. A place where he can harness its power. She pointed to a location on the map, a large, imposing building on the outskirts of the city.
The Citadel, she said.
It's an old fortress, built centuries ago. It has secret passages, hidden chambers, a network of tunnels beneath it. She looked at Margaret, her eyes searching hers. We need to get there, Margaret, she said. Before Thorn does. We need to retrieve the chronostone, to prevent him from using it. She paused, then added, her voice filled with a sense of urgency. And we need to save your father, she said. Before it's too late. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of hope, a determination to fight, to redeem herself, to make amends for her mistakes. But how? How could they infiltrate the Citadel, a fortress guarded by Thorn's men, a place filled with danger and uncertainty? Seraphine smiled, a knowing smile. We have an advantage, Margaret, she said. We know the past. And we have the watches. She explained her plan, a daring, risky plan that involved using the watches, the chronostone, and their knowledge of the past to their advantage. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. They would use the watches to create a brief, localized distortion in time, a stolen moment, just enough to slip past Thorn's guards, to enter the Citadel undetected. It was a dangerous maneuver, a delicate balancing act that could have unforeseen consequences. Margaret hesitated, her mind filled with doubts and fears. But she knew she had no choice. She had to trust Seraphine, to trust the watches, to trust in the power of love and loyalty to overcome the darkness that threatened to consume them. They prepared for their mission, gathering supplies, studying the map, rehearsing their plan. The stolen moment in time was their only hope, a fragile window of opportunity that could either save them or destroy them. The 2 watches ticked steadily, counting down to their confrontation with Thorn, to their desperate attempt to reclaim the chronostone, and to save her father from the clutches of a madman. The farmhouse, lit only by a faint glow of an oil lamp, was their planning center, as the world outside was a battlefield. Chapter 16. The Reckoning of Shadows. The Citadel loomed large and imposing against the night sky, a dark silhouette that seemed to exude an aura of menace and ancient power. Margaret and Seraphine approached cautiously, hidden in the shadows, their movements silent and synchronized. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the watches on Margaret's wrists. They reached the outer walls of the fortress, the massive stone blocks towering above them, seemingly impenetrable. Seraphine pointed to a small, concealed entrance, hidden behind a thick growth of ivy. This is it, she whispered. An old service tunnel. It leads to the lower levels of the Citadel. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. She felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, a sense of stepping into the unknown, of facing a challenge that would test her courage and her resolve to their limits. Seraphine produced a small, metal tool from her bag, a lockpick of intricate design. She worked quickly and silently, her fingers nimble and precise, manipulating the tumblers of the lock. A faint click echoed in the stillness, and the heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage that descended into the depths of the citadel. They slipped inside, Seraphine leading the way, her oil lamp casting a flickering glow over the damp, stone walls. The air was cold and musty, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper and deeper into the heart of the fortress. They heard the faint sounds of voices, the muffled footsteps of guards, the constant reminder that they were not alone, that danger lurked around every corner. They reached a large, vaulted chamber, its walls lined with ancient carvings and inscriptions. In the center of the chamber, a stone staircase spiraled downwards, disappearing into the darkness. "This leads to the lower levels," Seraphine whispered. "To the hidden chambers where Thorn will likely be." She paused, her gaze meeting Margaret's. "Are you ready?" she asked. Margaret nodded, her hand instinctively clutching the 2 watches. She was ready. She had to be. Her father's life, the fate of the Chronos Stone, and perhaps the future itself, depended on her. They descended the staircase, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder, the darkness more intense, the sense of oppression almost overwhelming. They reached a long, narrow corridor, its walls lined with heavy wooden doors. Seraphine stopped, listening intently. "I hear voices," she whispered. "From that room." At the end of the corridor, they crept forward, their movements slow and cautious, their senses on high alert. They reached the door, pressing their ears against the thick wood, trying to make out the conversation within. They heard Thorn's voice, cold and menacing, filled with a cruel triumph. "The Chronos Stone is ours," he said. "We can now control time itself. We can rewrite history, reshape the world to our liking." They heard another voice, a weaker, more hesitant voice. "Major Davies." "But the consequences," Captain Davies said. "We don't know what this will do. We could unleash chaos, destroy everything." Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the corridor. "Chaos is our ally, Major," he said. "It is the fuel of change, the engine of progress. We will create a new world, a better world, a world ruled by strength and power." Margaret felt a surge of anger, a righteous fury that burned away her fear. She had to stop him. She had to retrieve the Chronos Stone, to prevent him from unleashing its power upon the world. She looked at Seraphine, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Now," she whispered. "We do it now." Seraphine nodded, her face set in a mask of grim resolve. They prepared for the stolen moment, focusing their will on the watches, on the Chronos Stone, on the brief, localized distortion in time they were about to create. Margaret felt the familiar surge of energy, the dizzying sensation, as if the world around her was dissolving, melting away. The corridor began to shimmer, the walls blurring, the light of Seraphine's lamp flickering erratically. They burst through the door, into the chamber, their movements swift and unexpected. Thorn and Davies turned, startled, their eyes widening in surprise and disbelief.
"What?"
Thorn stammered. "How did you get in here?" Margaret and Seraphine didn't answer. They moved quickly, their actions synchronized, their focus absolute. Seraphine lunged at Davies, disarming him with a swift, precise movement, knocking him to the ground. Margaret focused on Thorn, on the Chronos Stone, which he held clutched in his hand, its ethereal light pulsating with a dangerous energy. She raised her hands, the 2 watches on her wrists, their ticking synchronized, their power amplified by her will, by her connection to the Chronos Stone. She willed Thorn to freeze, to be trapped in a moment, just as she had done before. But this time it was different. Thorn resisted. He fought back, his will clashing with hers, the power of the Chronos Stone amplifying his resistance. The chamber began to shake, the walls trembling, the air crackling with energy. The stolen moment was collapsing, the fabric of time unraveling. Margaret felt a searing pain in her head, a pressure building behind her eyes. She was losing control. She couldn't hold him. Thorn laughed, a triumphant, mocking laugh. "You can't stop me, Miss Calloway," he said. "The power is mine." He raised the chrono stone, preparing to unleash its full potential, to rewrite history, to reshape the world to his twisted vision. But then, something unexpected happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, a figure Margaret recognized instantly. Her father, James Calloway, freed from his captivity, somehow stood there, his face pale and determined, his eyes fixed on Thorn. He lunged at Thorn, tackling him to the ground, the chrono stone flying from his grasp. The chamber erupted in chaos. The stolen moment collapsed completely, the fabric of time snapping back into place. Margaret, Seraphine, Thorn, Davies, and her father all tumbled to the ground, disoriented and stunned. The reckoning of shadows had begun. The fight for the chrono stone, for the future, for the very fabric of time, was now a desperate, chaotic struggle, with the outcome uncertain, the stakes higher than ever before. The ticking of the two watches became a battle cry. Chapter 17. Whispers in the Trenches. The chaotic scene in the Citadel's hidden chamber unfolded like a fractured nightmare. Margaret, disoriented from the collapse of the stolen moment, struggled to regain her footing, her mind racing to assess the situation. Thorn and her father grappled on the floor, a desperate struggle for the chrono stone, which lay tantalizingly close, its ethereal glow pulsating with a dangerous energy. Davies, still reeling from Seraphine's attack, scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting between the combatants, his loyalty uncertain. Seraphine, ever vigilant, moved swiftly to secure Davies, preventing him from interfering. Margaret's focus, however, was laser-sharp on her father and Thorn. The years of pent-up grief, fear, and the burning desire to protect him fueled her actions. She lunged forward, reaching for the chrono stone, but Thorn, with a desperate surge of strength, kicked it away, sending it skittering across the stone floor, closer to the far wall of the chamber.
"No,"
Margaret cried out, her voice filled with anguish. James Calloway, despite his weakened state, fought with a fierce determination, fueled by years of pent-up anger and the desperate need to protect his daughter, to protect the world from Thorn's madness. He managed to land a blow on Thorn's jaw, staggering him, but Thorn, driven by his obsession, retaliated with a brutal kick, sending her father sprawling. Thorn scrambled towards the chrono stone, his eyes gleaming with a manic triumph. Margaret knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let him get his hands on it again. She focused on the two watches on her wrists, their ticking a steady rhythm in the chaos, their power the only weapon she had left. She tried to recreate the stolen moment, to freeze Thorn, to stop him from reaching the stone. But it wouldn't work. The chaotic energy in the chamber, the interference from the chrono stone itself, made it impossible to focus, to control the delicate balance of time. She had to find another way. She remembered her father's words, whispered in the trenches, words of caution, of warning, about the chrono stone's power, about its dangers. "It's not meant to be used, Margaret," he had said. "It's meant to be protected. Protected. Not controlled. Not wielded as a weapon." A sudden realization struck her. She didn't need to stop Thorn by force. She needed to protect the chrono stone, to make it inaccessible, to render it inert. She focused on the watches again, but this time, her intention was different. She wasn't trying to control time, to manipulate it. She was trying to shield the chrono stone, to create a barrier, a temporal lock that would prevent anyone from using its power. She felt a different kind of energy flowing through her, a calmer, more stable energy, a resonance with the watches, with the chrono stone, that felt right. As Thorn reached for the chrono stone, his fingers almost brushing against its surface, Margaret channeled her will, her intention, into the watches. A shimmering field of energy enveloped the chrono stone, a translucent barrier that solidified, encasing it in a protective cocoon. Thorn recoiled, his hand recoiling as if burned. He tried to touch it again, but his fingers met an invisible wall, an impenetrable barrier. What have you done?" he screamed, his voice filled with rage and frustration. Margaret stood there, trembling, her body drained of energy, but her heart filled with a sense of relief, of accomplishment. She had done it. She had protected the Chrono Stone. James Calloway, slowly getting to his feet, looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and awe. "Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse, "you saved us." Seraphine, having secured Davies, approached them, her expression grim but relieved.
"It's not over yet," she said.
"We need to get out of here. Thorne's men will be alerted." They turned to leave, but Thorne, his face contorted with fury, blocked their path. He had drawn a hidden knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the dim light. "You may have stopped me from using the Chrono Stone," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "but you won't escape me. I'll kill you all." He lunged at Margaret, his knife aimed at her heart. But James Calloway, with a speed and agility that belied his weakened state, stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. The knife plunged into his back, a sickening thud that echoed through the chamber. Margaret screamed, her world shattering around her. Her father crumpled to the ground, his body limp, his eyes staring up at her, filled with a mixture of love and regret. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run, save yourself," those were his last words. The whispers in the trenches had come full circle. A father's love, a daughter's sacrifice, a battle fought across time, all culminating in this heartbreaking moment. Margaret had saved the world, but she had lost her father. Again, this time forever. The ticking of the 2 watches was a deafening elegy. Chapter 18. The long road home. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the chamber spinning around Margaret as her father's lifeblood stained the cold stone floor. The image of his sacrifice, his final, loving gaze, was seared into her memory, a wound that would never fully heal. Thorne, his face a mask of twisted satisfaction, stood over her father's body, the bloody knife still clutched in his hand. Seraphine, with a cry of rage, lunged at Thorne, tackling him to the ground. They grappled fiercely, a whirlwind of desperate struggle, but Thorne, fueled by madness and a lifetime of military training, quickly gained the upper hand. He pinned Seraphine down, his knife poised to strike. Margaret, paralyzed by grief and shock, could only watch in horror as Thorne prepared to deliver the killing blow. But then, something shifted within her. The despair, the helplessness, gave way to a surge of raw, primal fury. She wouldn't let Thorne win. She wouldn't let her father's sacrifice be in vain. She focused on the 2 watches on her wrists, their ticking a steady, insistent rhythm in the chaos. She didn't try to control time, to manipulate it. She simply channeled her rage, her grief, her love for her father, into the watches, into the connection she had forged with the Chrono Stone, now encased in its protective barrier. A wave of energy emanated from her, a powerful force that slammed into Thorne, throwing him backwards, away from Seraphine, sending him crashing against the stone wall. He lay there, stunned, his body limp, his eyes wide with disbelief. Margaret didn't hesitate. She rushed to Seraphine's side, helping her to her feet. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling but firm.
"Now."
They left Thorne there, unconscious, in the hidden chamber of the citadel, leaving the Chrono Stone encased in its protective shield, a silent testament to the battle that had been fought, to the sacrifices that had been made. They fled the citadel, navigating the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding the guards, their movements swift and silent. They emerged from the fortress, into the cool night air, leaving behind the darkness and the danger, carrying with them the weight of their loss, the burden of their victory. They made their way back to Amiens, to Dubois's antique shop, a haven of safety and familiarity in a world that had been shattered and rearranged. Antoine Dubois greeted them with a mixture of relief and sorrow, his eyes filled with understanding as he saw the grief etched on Margaret's face. He tended to their wounds, both physical and emotional, providing them with food, shelter, and a space to mourn, to heal, to begin the long, arduous process of rebuilding their lives. Margaret stayed in Amiens for several weeks, helping Dubois in his shop, finding solace in the familiar routine, in the quiet rhythm of the clocks, in the presence of Seraphine, who had become a sister, a friend, a fellow traveler in the landscape of loss and resilience. She learned more about Seraphine's family, about their long history of protecting the Chronos Stone, about their dedication to preventing it from falling into the wrong hands. She learned about Isabella's bravery, her sacrifice, her unwavering loyalty to her father and to the cause. She also learned about Thorn. He had been captured by the French authorities, his crimes exposed, his madness revealed. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, a broken, defeated man, haunted by the ghosts of his victims. The Chronos Stone remained encased in its protective barrier, hidden in a secure location, its power neutralized, its threat contained. Margaret knew that it could never be truly destroyed, that its potential for both good and evil would always exist. But she had done everything she could to protect it, to prevent it from being used to alter the past, to rewrite history. Finally, the time came for Margaret to return to New York. She stood on the deck of the steamship, watching the coast of France recede into the distance, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She had lost her father, again, but this time, she had found something else. She had found courage, resilience, a strength she never knew she possessed. She had found a connection to her past, to her family, to a legacy of love and sacrifice that transcended time itself. She carried with her the 2 watches her father's and the one Du Bois had given her. They were no longer instruments of time manipulation, but symbols of remembrance, of connection, of the enduring power of love to overcome even death. The long road home was just beginning, a journey of healing, of rebuilding, of finding a new purpose in a world that had been forever changed by her journey into the past. But she was no longer alone. She carried with her the memories of her father, of Isabella, of Seraphine, of the sacrifices they had made, of the battles they had fought. And she carried with her the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, hope can endure, love can prevail, and the human spirit can triumph over adversity. The 2 watches now ticked softly, a gentle reminder of all she had lost and everything she had gained. Chapter 19. Beyond the Veil of Grief. The familiar skyline of New York City emerged from the mist, a sight that once filled Margaret with excitement and anticipation, but now evoked a complex mix of emotions. She had returned home, but home was no longer the same. The war, her journey through time, the loss of her father, had changed everything. The Fifth Avenue townhouse felt empty and hollow, a mausoleum filled with ghosts and memories. Her mother, Eleanor, still lost in her world of grief, greeted her with a mixture of relief and bewilderment, unable to comprehend the true extent of Margaret's journey, of the sacrifices she had made. Margaret tried to resume her life, to pick up the pieces of her shattered world, but it was difficult. The familiar routines, the social gatherings, the expectations of her social circle, all felt meaningless, irrelevant, after the horrors she had witnessed, the battles she had fought. She found solace in small things. In the quiet solitude of her room, in the ticking of the 2 watches on her nightstand, in the letters her father had written, which she reread countless times, finding new meaning, new understanding, in his words. She also found solace in a newfound purpose. She decided to dedicate her life to helping others, to honoring her father's legacy of healing and compassion. She volunteered at a local hospital, working with wounded veterans, providing them with comfort, care, and a listening ear. She discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience born of loss and hardship. She found a sense of community among the nurses, the doctors, the patients, a shared understanding of the fragility of life, the importance of human connection. She also kept in touch with Seraphine, writing letters across the ocean, sharing their experiences, their struggles, their hopes for the future. They had formed a bond, forged in the crucible of danger and loss, a bond that transcended distance and time. One day, Margaret received a letter from Antoine Du Bois. He wrote of the ongoing efforts to protect the Chronos Stone, of the continuing threat posed by those who sought to exploit its power. He also wrote of Seraphine's work, of her dedication to carrying on her family's legacy, of her courage and resilience in the face of adversity. And then he wrote of something else. Something that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. There are rumors, Du Bois wrote, of a young American doctor working in a small village in France near the Somme. He is said to be a skilled surgeon, a compassionate healer, a man who has dedicated his life to helping the war wounded. He bears a striking resemblance to your father, Margaret. And he wears a watch, a gold pocket watch, with a cracked face, frozen at 10:17. Margaret read the letter again and again, her mind reeling.
Could it be?
Could her father have somehow survived? Could the Chronos Stone, despite her efforts to neutralize it, have had some unforeseen effect, some ripple in time that had altered his fate? She knew it was a long shot, a desperate hope, a possibility that defied logic and reason. But she couldn't ignore it. She had to know. She booked passage on the next steamship to France, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. She didn't tell her mother, knowing that the journey, the potential disappointment, would be too much for her fragile spirit to bear. She returned to Amiens, to Du Bois's antique shop, to the familiar scent of old books and the soothing tick-tock of countless clocks. Du Bois greeted her with a warm embrace, his eyes filled with understanding and a hint of hope. He confirmed the rumors, providing her with more details about the young American doctor, about his work, about his resemblance to her father. He gave her the name of the village, the location of the small hospital where he worked. Margaret set out on her journey, her heart filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She traveled by train, by bus, by foot, through the war-scarred landscape of France, her destination a small, remote village near the Somme, the place where her father had died, the place where he might, impossibly, still be alive. She arrived in the village, a quiet, unassuming place, still bearing the scars of war, but slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding, recovering. She found the hospital, a small, makeshift building, overflowing with patients, their bodies and minds wounded by the conflict. She asked for the American doctor, her voice trembling, her heart pounding. A nurse pointed her towards a small room at the back of the hospital. Margaret approached the room, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. And there he was. He was younger than she remembered, his hair darker, his face unlined by the years of war and grief. But it was him, her father. He was working on a patient, his hands moving with a familiar skill, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't notice her at first, too absorbed in his task. Margaret stood there, frozen, tears streaming down her face. She had found him. Again. But something was different. He didn't recognize her. He looked up, startled by her presence, his eyes widening in surprise, but not in recognition. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice kind but unfamiliar. Margaret couldn't speak. The words caught in her throat, choked by the emotions that overwhelmed her. She had found her father, but he was not her father. He was a different version, a man from a different timeline, a man who had never known her, never loved her. The veil of grief had been lifted, only to reveal a different kind of sorrow, a poignant, bittersweet reality. The ticking of the two watches was a soft lament. Chapter 20. The Heart's True North. The realization washed over Margaret like a cold wave. This man, though bearing the unmistakable likeness of her father, was a stranger. He had her father's eyes, his hands, his gentle demeanor, but his memory held no trace of her. The Chronos Stone, in its enigmatic way, had created a paradox, a branching path in the river of time. "I am sorry," Margaret stammered, backing away, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "I thought you were someone else." The young doctor smiled kindly, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "It happens," he said. "We all have doubles somewhere, I suppose." He returned to his patient, leaving Margaret standing there, her heart a chaotic mix of grief, relief, and a profound sense of displacement. She had journeyed across time and oceans, driven by a desperate hope, only to find a bittersweet truth. Her father was gone, truly gone, but his essence, his spirit, lived on in this altered reality. She left the hospital, her steps heavy, her mind reeling. She wandered through the village, the quiet streets, the war-scarred buildings, all echoing with the ghosts of her past and the phantom of a future that never was. She found herself drawn to the village cemetery, a peaceful, secluded place overlooking the rolling hills of the Somme. She walked among the headstones, reading the names, the dates, the epitaphs, each one a story of loss, of sacrifice, of lives cut short by the war. She found a small, unmarked grave, a simple wooden cross bearing no name, no date. She knew, instinctively, that this was where Isabella was buried. She knelt beside the grave, tears streaming down her face, offering a silent prayer for Isabella, for Seraphine, for all those who had been lost in the struggle against Thorn, against the darkness that had threatened to consume the world. She also thought of her father, of the man she had found in the hospital, a man who was both familiar and strange, a living testament to the enduring power of love and sacrifice. She realized that she couldn't stay here, in this altered past, clinging to a phantom of her father. She had to return to her own time, to her own life, to the world she had left behind. She returned to Amiens, to Du Bois's antique shop, to the familiar comfort of his presence, of his wisdom. She told him everything about her encounter with the young doctor, about her realization, about her decision to return home. Du Bois listened patiently, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. Time, he said, his voice soft, is a river, Margaret. It flows in many directions, creates many branches, many possibilities. We cannot control it, but we can choose our own path, our own destination. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. You have done everything you could, Margaret, he said. You have honored your father's memory. You have protected the Chronos Stone. You have fought bravely against the darkness. Now, it is time to live your own life, to find your own happiness. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. The heart, Margaret, he said, knows its true north. Follow it. It will guide you home. Margaret prepared for her journey back to New York, her heart heavy but resolute. She said goodbye to Seraphine, their farewell filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude, a promise of continued friendship, of a bond that transcended time and distance. She stood on the deck of the steamship, watching the coast of France recede into the distance, the 2 watches on her nightstand, their ticking a steady, reassuring rhythm, a reminder of her journey, of her losses, of her triumphs. She knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, that the scars of the past would always be with her. But she also knew that she was stronger, wiser, more resilient than she had ever been before. She had faced the darkness, had battled against the forces of time itself, and had emerged, not unscathed, but transformed. She had learned the true meaning of love, of sacrifice, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. She looked out at the vast, endless ocean, the horizon stretching before her, filled with both uncertainty and possibility. She had returned to her own time, but she was no longer the same woman who had left. She was a woman who had traveled through time, who had faced her demons, who had found her strength, who had discovered her heart's true north. She arrived to find a letter waiting for her. It was from Robert, her former fiancé, her almost husband. He had, himself, served in the war, and wrote of his profound regret. He had been wrong. He knew that now. The war had changed him, had shaped him, and he had begun to understand that Margaret's burdened past was not so burdened, after all. He wished to see her, if she would have him. The 2 watches ticked gently on her nightstand. The time was right. Margaret smiled, a tear trickling down her cheek. It was time to move on. The heart's true north was calling, and Margaret had finally set the course. Epilogue. Years passed. The world moved on, slowly, painfully, from the ravages of the Great War. Margaret Calloway, once a young woman lost in grief and uncertainty, blossomed into a force of nature. She never forgot her journey through time, the lessons she had learned, the sacrifices she had witnessed. The 2 watches, her father's and its twin, remained treasured possessions, kept safe, their ticking a constant reminder of a past that, while altered, could never be erased. She and Robert reconciled, their reunion a testament to the healing power of time and the enduring strength of love. They married, not in a grand, societal affair, but in a quiet, intimate ceremony, surrounded by the few close friends and family who truly understood their journey. Eleanor, though still frail, found a measure of peace in her daughter's happiness, a glimmer of light in the long shadow of her grief. Margaret continued her work at the hospital, dedicating her life to helping others, to easing the suffering of those wounded by war, both physically and emotionally. She became a skilled nurse, her compassion and empathy a source of comfort and healing to countless patients. She specialized in helping veterans cope with the trauma of their experiences, drawing upon her own journey to provide them with understanding and support. She and Robert had children, a son and a daughter, whom they named James and Isabella, honoring the memories of those who had been lost, of those who had sacrificed everything for a better future. She told them stories of her father, of his bravery, his compassion, his unwavering belief in the power of good. She also told them, in veiled terms, of her own adventure, of the lessons she had learned about time, about loss, about the importance of fighting for what is right. Seraphine remained a close friend, their correspondence spanning decades, their bond forged in the crucible of war and time travel, a testament to the enduring power of sisterhood. Seraphine continued her work in France, carrying on her family's legacy of protecting the innocent, of fighting against the forces of darkness, a quiet, unsung hero in a world slowly recovering from chaos. The Chronos Stone remained hidden, encased in its protective barrier, a secret known only to a select few, a legacy passed down through generations, a reminder of the potential for both good and evil that lies within the fabric of time itself. Margaret often visited her father's grave, a simple marker in a quiet corner of a New York cemetery. She would sit there, talking to him, sharing her joys and sorrows, her triumphs and failures, feeling his presence in the gentle breeze, in the warmth of the sun, in the quiet rustling of the leaves. She knew that he was gone, truly gone, but his spirit lived on, in her memories, in her actions, in the love that she carried in her heart. And she knew that, in some strange, inexplicable way, he was proud of her, of the woman she had become, of the life she had built. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city, Margaret sat on the porch of her home, watching her children play in the garden. Robert sat beside her, his arm around her, their hands clasped together. She felt a deep sense of peace, of contentment, of gratitude for the life she had been given, for the love she had found, for the journey she had undertaken. She had traveled through time, had faced unimaginable dangers, had lost and found, had grieved and healed. She looked at the two watches, resting on a small table beside her, their ticking a soft, steady rhythm in the twilight. They were no longer instruments of magic, of time manipulation, but symbols of remembrance, of connection, of the enduring power of love to transcend all boundaries, even the boundaries of time itself. The watches ticked. Time flowed. Life continued. And Margaret Calloway, the woman who had traveled through time, knew that she was finally home. The end.